I offer historic trades as a guidepost. I think there are modes of work that lend themselves to families integrating, building, reinforcing family bonds. Families working together creates resiliency. And that resilient families working with other resilient families creates stable communities. And we're going to need some stable communities for the storm that is coming. Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing? You get some good sleep? You ready for some edification in the Lord? Ready to sharpen some iron this morning? I am really excited to be here. I'm very grateful to be here. My name is Rory Groves, as Chris mentioned, and I'm from Minnesota, also known as Minnesota. And I'm reminded of my accent, my northern Norwegian, Swedish accent every time I travel outside the state. I was down in Texas at a conference, and everyone was coming up to me making fun of my Minnesota accent, don't you know? And don't you know, y'all? I'm not the only one with an accent here, but it used to be a quaint thing to tell people that I was from southern Minnesota, rural Minnesota. And now people glare at me when I tell them I'm from Minnesota. There's been a lot of upheaval in recent years, and our state isn't as innocent as it once was maybe thought as a Midwestern state. So I always try to caution that we're from rural Minnesota, and we're aware of some of the breakdowns that we see happening all around us very vividly. We've had a front row seat to some very tumultuous times up in our neck of the woods, but it's happening in all across the world. It's happening all across this country, in every city, in every town. And so I wanted to just start out this morning by sharing a little bit about who I am and why I'm here, and how did we end up? There's a picture of me on the brochure standing in front of a tractor with my family, and I wanted to just explain really briefly why we ended up on a farm. About 10 years ago, we moved out to a hobby farm. But that whole time, I was a computer programmer. In fact, for the last 20 plus years, that's been my entire career. I was a software developer. I've owned multiple technology firms. As I started to work on this, this was something that for me as a young man, it's all I ever wanted to do. I enjoyed it. I was good at it. Made a lot of money doing it. And it was something that was exciting. The pace of change was exciting to me. Everything, constant innovation, everything is getting new all the time. All these new technologies coming out. Well, you fast forward about 20 years and you add 5 kids into the mix. We now have 6 kids. And the rapid change of innovation, or the rapid innovation, has another side of that coin, which is obsolescence. And I found myself in this career after about 20 years seeing pretty much everything that I create go obsolete in a couple of years. And any of you who work in the field know what I'm talking about. And even my skill sets, constantly having to retrain. And wondering, am I going to be in the same boat 20 years from now? Do I want to continue investing in something that's going to continually be made obsolete and outmoded and out-innovated? Or are there other career options at this juncture that I could maybe go into that might have a little more lasting power? I thought you'd hear about these generational family businesses that would be passed on from the father to the son to the grandson. We have some 4th generation businesses here today, which is very cool, very rare. But you'd hear about these things. And I was in a profession that, pretty much wouldn't last 3 years if I didn't continuously retrain. So I just kind of started to wonder, is there some other options out there for men, for me, for our family, that we could go into, still produce a living, but maybe do something that was going to be around a little longer. And of course, we're looking on, reading the handwriting on the wall. We don't know how stable things are going to always be. Maybe there's something I can do to become more self-sufficient, get ahead of this thing with my family and be better prepared for uncertain times. The other aspect of it was, when I was in a corporate job, whether I was literally in someone's cubicle or even if I was working from home, the main part of my work and my day was alone. I was working, it was me and the keyboard, and it was me and the screen. And it bothered me as I was trying to raise my children and build a strong family and a godly family. It bothered me that for the majority of what I did for the day, I couldn't involve my family with me. And here again, this concept of the family business and the generational family business has really piqued my interest. And I just wanted to know, are there options for guys like me who want to do something with their families, who want to build something that's more stable? And that question just kind of burned in my mind, and it became a book. The short answer, I never meant to write Durable Trades as a book. I was just trying to answer that question. I sat down, I started investigating what would be my options. I literally have a spreadsheet on my desktop, and I started writing down what are some historical family-based businesses that are unlikely to be automated in the next few years. And I ended up thinking and doing some reading and ran into some other authors like Mr. Wiley and Alan Carlson, and it started to just do, and Kevin Swanson, it just started to do some more introspection on this. And that mushroomed into what became a book. Somewhere along the process, as I was writing and thinking about this, I wondered maybe there are some other families out there that have the same question that I do. I had no idea, honestly. The book went through, its process. That's a whole ordeal trying to get a book published. But when it came out, I honestly had no idea if anyone would ever care, or if my question was so obscure that it only applied to my family. But it still was worth it because we did answer the question for our family. And we did begin moving in a different direction. I mentioned that we moved to a hobby farm. It's a little over 10 years ago now, and hobby is the operative word here. I wasn't planning to quit my job to become a farmer at all, but one of the things that I noticed was that as we lived on the farm, and today we have chickens and goats and lambs and sheep and rabbits. My son is into rabbitry. We have hogs. We have 10 acres right now, and some of it is wood, some of it is tillable land that we do haying on and things like that. And the focus today isn't how to farm. But one of the things that started to happen is my interest in high technology that I had had for 30 plus years started to dissipate, and I didn't see that coming. I would almost explain it that like I came out to the farm thinking I'm just going to enjoy the idea of the country life, the hobby side of it. But it's like the land had its own effect on me that I didn't see coming. It's interesting because in the scriptures, there's an anthropomorphic aspect to the land. The land is a character in the Word of God, the promised land. There is an impact that land has, the Garden of Eden. All of the geography in the scripture, it has its own will almost, so to speak. Of course, that will is derived from God's will, and when He connects us back with the land, something happens, and that's exactly what happened to our family. Blair Adams said, "Our ancestors knew what the framework for life was. They saw the land as the loom of life, and they laid out the threads of their lives directly onto the land." So what would happen is I'd have this contrast after a couple of years or so where we'd be working in the garden together as a family, harvesting potatoes, maybe getting eggs from the chicken coop, maybe baling hay. And then I would leave all of that time with my family, work with my family, to go to my quote-unquote real job, which was sitting by myself, staring at a computer screen, typing on a keyboard. And it was such an artificial construct. I just began to wonder, why is my real job so artificial? And the job that's the hobby is actually more enduring and real and time with my family, and it's producing harvests that literally feed us through the winters. We have long winters in Minnesota. So this was, to me, a more integrated way to live. The farm was, for me, for our family. And what was it? As I reflect back on it, what made it the loom of life, as Adams describes it? Well, as I mentioned, the family was integrated. Children were not impediments to this way of work. They were actually integral. I needed my kids. Like the farm, that context is something that is actually, you need the family. Children are truly blessings. There were natural rhythms. It wasn't the same work day after day, week after week. month, and year after year. Every day was different. The seasons varied. We were, I would say, living by God's created order, the rhythms of nature. We were more dependent on God and more attuned to Him. Pray for rain. It's not just a colloquialism. It's a real thing. Then there were the tangible results of our labor. I was used to seeing everything I did in high tech kind of, as I said, go obsolete. Or it just wasn't tangible. It produced money, and that's important. Those are all important things. But there wasn't this tangible thing where you put a seed in the ground and then God makes it grow, and then you're harvesting food right out of the produce of your land. There was just something that I had been missing in my career up to that point that was very attractive about that. And so that's where I started to ask myself if it was possible to live this way all the time. And that's where the book came out of. And the answer to that question is yes. That's the spoiler for the book. But the book contains pre-industrial trades that have survived at least 200 years and still can produce a viable income today for families. But I don't rank it according to income. I rank it according to things like family-centeredness, historical stability, resiliency. How well do these professions bounce back from recessions or depressions? What are the barriers to entry? Does it require a lot of college education or advanced degrees? Does it require an incredible amount of startup capital to do these things? So I used a whole metric to kind of, and again, just for our own family, I just wanted to know what my options were. So I used this whole kind of ranking method to discover, first of all, what was historical and what was sustainable, and then how family-centered were they? How durable and stable were they? Because I wanted the most durable and the most stable professions. I was looking at a completely radical shift in my career, and I wanted to make sure I was doing my homework. So along with the process of researching for durable trades, I came across this concept called the family economy. Alan Carlson was my original source for that, and other authors like C.R. Wiley, Kevin Swanson, and others have written on this and have done a lot of great work, and I encourage you to check out their books on the households. One way I would differentiate family economy from a family business, I would put it this way: a family business is about the business. We have family business. We live in rural Minnesota, so we have family farms, family businesses all around us. And you can tell when you're at a family business and it doesn't have the life to it that a family economy does. People are still working in that business and they might be miserable in that business. Well, that's because a family business is about the business. A family economy is about the relationships. The business becomes a context for improving the health and the life of that family, a generational inheritance. And so that, I'm going to go into this a little bit, but that's the concept I want you to keep in mind. Kevin Swanson uses an example of an axe and a handle. He says, if you use an axe head to try to take down a tree, just chopping it with your hand, you're not going to get very far. It's going to be very difficult. But if you put a handle on that axe head, your capability for useful work increases 100-fold, right? You can now start to take down trees. That's the basic idea of the family economy. It's combining all of the elements of that family towards one unified purpose, and then beginning to take dominion or beginning to advance the family's interests together. Kevin says, the basic economic unit is not an individual, and it is not a corporation or the government. According to the creation mandate and 5,900 years of historical practice, the basic economic unit is the family. This is how we were meant to live. The family was the source of provision for most of human history, not the factory. I would equate it to like a man who lives under the blinding lights of the city. The artificial lights that hide, it's hard to see the sky. People come out to the country sometimes, in Minnesota at least, when there's a northern lights that are going to appear. Why do they do that? You can't see it from the city. The artificial lights are blinding you. Oftentimes you can't even see the stars. But we come out of the city and we are stunned. When we moved 10 years ago, we were amazed at how brilliant the stars are, just an hour away from where we used to live, because there were not the artificial lights. God was declaring his glory through the heavens. And it was there for us all along. It had always been there, but we were just obscuring it. We were blinded by our own artificialness in what we had created, the man-made elements. And I think the family economy is kind of like that. It's always been there, but in our carnal wisdom, we've chosen an artificial life. We have blinded ourselves from the natural way God intended us to live. And in so doing, we've blinded ourselves from the revelation and declaration of God's glory. The historic understanding of the family as a work unit is obviously a very different contrast from what we see in the typical American household today, where dad spends most of his day laboring apart from his family, where mom often works outside the home for a boss who is not her husband, where children are left to the care of strangers and siblings are separated into age-segregated schools. And even into our churches, we see the same thing. Children often worship separately from their parents in junior church, we'll have in some churches. That's where I had when I was growing up. Spiritual formation has become the purview of youth pastors rather than fathers. This leads to what C.R. Wiley refers to as recreational households. We have families that are not required anymore in order to subsist, so they become a source of emotional fulfillment. Marriages reduced to a lifestyle choice rather than actually needing each other. The axe head and the axe handle, actually needing each other to do something significant. Children become burdens, and families have fewer of them. We abandon the historical functions that used to be the purview of the family, such as education and work and worship and childcare and elder care. And so what was for thousands of years a self-producing and self-sustaining community becomes an overnight parking place. This is not the idea. This is not the model God intended when he instituted the family. And I think that this is the reason that we find an unprecedented breakdown in our generation, and a mass exodus from the Christian faith, which was passed on primarily through families for the last 50 years. I won't go into the statistics, but we're basically in free fall right now. Across the board, in every category of family integrity and family function and Christian adoption of the next generation. How did we get here? Well, in a word, it was the Industrial Revolution had a lot to do with it. And I'm not going to go into deep details on this. I treat it in my book if you're interested, and there's other authors who treat it as well. But I did want to point out a few of the rotten fruits of this idea of industrialism and this way of life that we adopted about 200 years ago, just to shed a little bit of light on it. First of all, urbanization and crime. So as the factories arose in the late 18th century, people, of course, began to leave the farm in order for gainful employment in the city. When they did this, they disrupted what was a generational way of life. To actually take a job in the city meant usually a lot more money in the short term, but what it severed was the relationships, the generational mentorship and apprenticeship that used to take place on the farm or in the smithy or in the artisan's craft shop. From between 1790 and 1840, the population in American cities grew from 200,000 to 3.6 million, so an 18-fold increase. It's a massive, seismic demographic shift. We also see the rise of the first police departments during that time. Prior to 1830s, there were no police departments in America for the first 200 years that we settled these shores. Communities policed themselves. Families policed their own. Communities were comprised of kin, and there was a natural order to those kin relationships to keep each other in check. I'd also mention that some of the attention headline generating crime clashes with police and all kinds of stuff that we're seeing in our culture today, a lot of that can be traced back to the breakdown of law and order, which used to come via the family. People used to live in relationship with each other. And now when you have cities of strangers living next to each other, it requires the iron fist of the law. And the iron fist creates more rebellion, and more rebellion creates a tighter fist. So these are things that used to be, if you think about it, policing was out of love. I mean, that love was rooted both for the victim but also for the perpetrator in some circumstances. We've lost all that because we're no longer engaging as fathers anymore to a larger community flock that we would have, where we'd have respected elders in our communities that could speak to issues that would become problems down the road to our young people. We're kind of like left to our own devices. And as I said, the coercive power of the state. Number 2, factory schools. State-run rather than private and family-run schools came onto the scene about this time. They wanted to mass-produce workers in the same way that they mass-produced wool. You have to understand, this concept of the factory mindset was so pervasive. It was kind of seen as the panacea to all of life's ills, was to mass-produce things, break things, subdivide labor, mass production, assembly line, factory. We were creating so much abundance at this time that the people initially were not seeing what are the long-term effects of this separating out of relationships. The first compulsory education attendance laws were passed in Massachusetts in 1852. Laws that would stand for more than 100 years. For the first time since freedom-seeking pilgrims settled on American shores, it became illegal to educate one's own children in one's own home. By the way, if you look this up in Barnstable, Massachusetts, 1852, this was the last holdout town, the last community was resisting the government schools. And so they literally brought out the militia to force, in Massachusetts, to force the residents of Barnstable to send their kids to the publicly delegated school or publicly denoted school. At gunpoint, they marched the students to school. And you can look that up, it actually happened. Make no mistake about it, public education was never intended to increase the nation's literacy, but to create compliant laborers, able to satiate the demands of the growing industrial behemoth. Number 3, fractured families. As I had already alluded to, factories replaced the families. Men entered the coal mines. Women entered the textile mills. One of our founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, said that women would be more useful in the factories than they would otherwise be at home. Children entered the coal mines and factories too. They were known as trapper boys. In my book, I have a picture of a young boy named Willie Bryden. I believe he was 12 or 13 years old, and his sole job was to open a mule cart door for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, 500 feet underground and a quarter of a mile further down the shaft from there. And so this is here you go. Here you have an example of a family that was initially on a farm. Father leaves to go to the mines. Children go into the mines. Wives go into the textile mills. And they're all making more money. But what's happened to that family? They used to be working, probably no less hours on the farm. I'm imagining, it's a ton of work to work on the farm. But you're together. All of the labor is together on a traditional subsistence type of a farm. Alan Carlson writes, "The most socially disruptive effect of the Industrial Revolution was the way it severed the place where adults work from the place where adults live. Most of our current family questions, from loud disputes over gender roles to childcare to low fertility, derive from this great disruption." Now, in the case of like the Willie Brydens of the world, we've resolved some of the abuses with child labor laws and things like that, but we never reunited the family. The families are still separated. So what do we do about it? So I offer historic trades as a guidepost. I think this is the rock that we haven't looked under. I think this is the ancient path. I think there are modes of work that lend themselves to families integrating and building, reinforcing family bonds. There are other modes of work, largely modern industrial forms of work, that work against that family unification. As a lifelong technologist, I don't believe that technology or artificial intelligence will solve these problems. And I think we need to go back to the ancient paths. If my book has any thesis, it is that families working together creates resiliency. And that resilient families working with other resilient families creates stable communities. And we're going to need some stable communities for the storm that is coming. So I wanted to give you a few practical applications of this, what I believe are several characteristics of a biblical household. I think the number one thing to keep in mind is to shift our way of thinking about the family and the household. That's the whole point of the family economy. It's not specifically what job you do, although that can be part of it. It's how you view your family and what did God purpose your family to do. A household in the traditional sense was an enterprise. It was the source from which all subsistence for the family sprang. So in other words, rather than depending on an employer or a factory for the things you need, you depended on each other. Most of the time, it was multi-generational, and often it included extended relatives. And so with that in mind, let's look at some of the characteristics of a biblical household. Number one, they're led by fathers. I'll put it very simply. There is no family economy without the father. My wife and I have been engaged in a sort of ministry to families that feel drawn in this direction. We host events at our farm. We publish books, and we also publish a newsletter. And the entire intention is to encourage other families who want to travel in this direction. I've had many conversations with young men here who are trying to go this way. They feel this call on their lives, and they're just looking for help. So my wife and I have devoted the rest of our lives to trying to help folks like that. What else do I want to say about that? Well, there's a lot of you out there, so it's encouraging. One of the things that we've noticed when families approach us and ask for help, oftentimes, maybe they might ask us over for dinner, and they'll sit down with us, and the wife will start bringing up some ideas that they have maybe for homesteading or a farm idea or a business idea. And they'll kind of go through these, and often what we have to do, the first question we have to start with is, because oftentimes the wife is leading these conversations, we'll have to start with the question is the wife submitted to her husband? Is the father leading this home? And it's not like we want to get into the middle of a huge fight over, the gender roles. It's just the plain fact of it. A family economy cannot work unless the father is leading it. It's just absolutely begins with the fathers. Last night I shared about the hearts of the fathers turning to their children. I mean, there's a reason why that is the impetus of a revival in the home and in the society in which that happens. Because once the father's hearts are turned, that's the inception of something new happening in that family. The statistics, we heard those last night. Chris shared about the statistics of if a father is leading his family in the faith and the difference that it makes versus if the wife or if the mother is trying to lead those children in the faith. It just makes an incredible difference. So in the case of the family economy, someone has an idea, they have a vision, and I think that the intentions are right. The wife feels I'm not yoked up with my husband. Our children, we're losing them. There's something's way off. So maybe if we all work together, we can amend this. And they hear us talking about it and encouraging families. But if dad is checked out, there's just not that much that can be done about that. Dad has to be on board. And so this is a principle that we've just seen play out, is that in our own marriage, as we've learned to try to walk in this way, and also in the marriages of those around us, that if the wife will submit to her husband, the husband will lead. If the wife attempts to lead, the husband retreats. And I think it's not so much about the specific idea that will bring your family, to fruition and happiness and so on and so forth, human flourishing. It's more about the structure that enables that idea to come to life. God wants to put in order, a biblical order around your household. Once the order is in place, all kinds of blessings can connect with your family. But he's more concerned about the relationships in that family and doing it in a biblical way than he is about dad coming home, say, leaving the corporate life to do something at home with the kids. It's much more about creating a holistic family structure. And I think that's just what we've seen. Now, I want to say that men, your wives want to be yoked up with you. They want to be on an adventure with you, going somewhere with your family. The thing is that she was not designed to carry that load. You were. God created you to carry the load of a mission for your family and to implement that vision. The father, the paterfamilias, the priest of the home, the head of the household, carries the vision given by God and oversees the implementation of that vision for the benefit of the whole family. And since we published Durable Trades, we've received literally hundreds of letters from other families looking for another way forward. And for the most part, we're hearing from fathers. And I believe this is why I believe that God is doing a work in families, because he's starting with fathers. We're seeing these hearts turn. I wanted to just share one brief letter that we received. This is from TJ. And he wrote to us and said this: "Hey brother, your book made a significant impact on my life. I was a fed working a mindless existence in a fluorescently lit office away from my wife and kids 50 to 60 hours a week, feeling like I didn't even know them. I read your book and it completely reframed the way I viewed work and the family. I have 2 sons and 1 daughter, and I want to leave a legacy for them. After 9 years in government, 8 active duty and 1 in FBI, I left it for a company where I can essentially determine my own hours, work 60 to 80% from home, and actually spend my life with my children while building something worthwhile that they can inherit. I can't thank you enough for the Durable Trades book. I'm not a tradesman, but I do believe my kids will be, and this will be the first book that I have them read once they're able." You can hear that in his voice. You can see that the inspiration, the spark is there, that now he's turning to his children and God is going to bless that enterprise, already has blessed that enterprise. And I'm going to stand here, I'm going to tell all of you, I have faith for your families. We have seen it too many times where God has turned the tide when the men have turned their hearts. I have faith for your family. We pray for you guys all the time. My family gets together every single night and we pray over dozens of prayer requests that come in through the newsletter of families who are in the same boat, in the same place. They're standing at the same edge of the same impassable sea. You know what we tell them? Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of your Lord. We have seen God part the seas many times for many families, and he will do it for yours. If he has put a dream on your heart, he has a plan for getting you there. Your job is to steward that vision and then to take it one step at a time. You may not know how you're going to get through the sea. That's up to God. But you do know you need to walk forward in the light that he has revealed to you. Number 2, shared vision. Biblical households have a shared vision. These are families operating under a common vision. It is not dad commuting an hour away at 6 a.m. and coming home at 6 p.m. and watching a few hours of television, then repeating it all over again the next day. It is not the kids separated by age into government schools and daycare. The family is together, and they are moving lockstep toward a vision God has given them. Number 3, biblical households spend time together. You can't have a biblical household without time together. Harold Lee says, "The most important of the Lord's work that you and I will ever do will be within the walls of your own home." So time is the number 1 component of a family economy. It's the whole point. Actually, the idea of the family economy exists as a pretext to allow discipleship to happen. I believe that's the true intention. You know, he says in Deuteronomy 6, to speak of these commandments to your children. When you lie down, when you rise, when you walk by the way, when you're sitting, when you're coming, and when you're going. You know, and what happens when families are not sitting by each other anymore, when they're not walking by the way anymore, when they're not just together through the daily life? You miss out on that opportunity for discipleship. The average father, according to the BLS, spends 5 hours a day watching television, but 34 minutes caring for household children. Homeschooling, I think, is a significant step in this direction. Someone calculated that at a minimum, if you homeschool your kids, you are adding 11,000 hours of direct time together with your children. In other words, public school demands 11,000 hours of your child's life in the classroom. So if you just think about that, it's an incredible amount of time of discipleship together. But even you have to be cautious because even in homeschooling circles, there can be many activities. You can encumber the family with a lot of distractedness, and it might actually defeat the purpose. Even if you approach the idea is a good idea, but there's always still ways to corrupt it. The goal is that you have time together. Working is what I've been saying is really the primary way that we build those generational bonds, and that's why our culture is so divided, because when we subdivided labor, we subdivided the family. Number 4, biblical households engage in purposeful work. Have any of you heard the term the Great Resignation? This was thrown around last year a little bit. The Great Resignation was the unprecedented increase, a 50% increase in the number of people who just up and quit their job. They were calculating from 2021. 47 million people voluntarily quit their job, a third of the American workforce in 2021. And, And it ran completely contrary to everything that managements and corporations and consultants would have expected, because we were in the middle of a massive recession. Well, it was bouncing back, but there were incredible upheaval in the job market. And so this would have historically been a time where nobody would have quit their job, but yet we saw a third of the workforce turn over. And we saw things like CEOs were quitting jobs, with nowhere else to go. Or they'd maybe take a part-time job at an organic farm. But people were fed up, right? They were looking for another way to do life. They were not doing purposeful work up to that point. In my opinion, I don't think it's baffling. I think it was a long time in coming. I think the pandemic was a catalyst for that. It's not that people don't want to work, it's that they want their work to mean something, and they want to perform it with people who mean something to them. In other words, they don't want to be stuck in high-paying but unfulfilling jobs. They don't want to be efficient cogs in a machine. They want to do something that matters, something that is purposeful, and that is something that biblical households are all about. Number 5, biblical households are productive. They are entrepreneurial. If you step back a couple hundred years, virtually the entire workforce were proprietors. At least 80+% of them. Today, less than 10% of the population are proprietors. That means that 90% of the adult population works for someone else. I don't think this is a biblical model. I think the creation mandate to take dominion did not come to CEOs and boards of directors and corporations. Take dominion came to families. And biblical families throughout history have always taken hold of this command to expand the family's interests and productive capacities. I'm not trying to say that it's unbiblical to be a wage earner. I'm just saying that this is not the default historical position. And I think that it's not the original design. It's a fairly recent innovation in the West, and pretty much only in very modern, westernized, or highly industrialized cultures that we see the vast majority ceding their proprietorship to impersonal corporate forces. Now, that said, don't go and quit your job on Monday and open a lemonade stand with your kids on the side of the road. You need to take this one step at a time. Every household will be different. For the vision that God put on our heart, I'll tell you the beginning of our vision was just asking the question, is there another way? That was the beginning. That led to a book. That book led to some conferences. Those conferences led to the realization that we want to do this as a ministry. We want to keep doing this. It took us about a period of 5 years. I shut down my computer business last April, so it's been about a little over a year. But it was a long time in coming, and there was a process there. And God has a process for your family too. But the point is, do something. Start taking some steps towards building your productive capacity as a family and do it together. Then expand that stake. Something that you own, and then expand that stake. Number 6, biblical families are also productive in other ways, namely children. They are fruitful and multiplying. Because they view themselves as part of a larger enterprise, a multi-generational enterprise, they do not view children as burdens, but as blessings. Something that I've seen, and I just anecdotally, is that when you get into a community or a church that's thriving and the fathers are leading, they're very entrepreneurial. Have you noticed that, Chris? Everywhere I go. And it's not just the Reformed Presbyterians either. I mean, it's like across the denominations. If the men are leading their families and they're discipling their sons and daughters, it just seems to go hand in hand that they're very entrepreneurial. They're very productive. Their children are expanding the family's interests, which is interesting. But I guess I'm starting to understand it, and I'll try to speak to it. You have a father who's putting his hand to the plow and trying to do something, trying to start a family economy. The children naturally are part of that effort. The children are learning how to start a business. The children are learning how to work with people. Children are learning how to have a work ethic from a young age. You know, I think that we do a disservice to our children when we hold them in a chair and a desk for 18 to 22 years and then expect them to come out into the general job market with a work ethic. We need to have them working hard. Work needs to be a normal way of life for our kids. Well, anyway, those things happen. I mean, we have a farm. They work hard. I mean, it's like not an option. We're going to eat, so everybody's working and everyone's working hard. But when that happens, your children are beginning to develop their own family enterprises while they're still a part of your family enterprise. And I've just seen this over and over again. People buying coffee shops or people starting, machining shops, people getting into different types of breeding stock of animals, people starting seed companies. And you just start to see where there's a niche, these families have the capacity because they have children. They're multi-generational. Those children rise up and that may become their family economy, that they bring their children in. And I'll tell you, the really amazing thing is when you see this worked out to the third and fourth generation, it will blow your mind. You see 4 generations, great-grandpa down to the grandkids. You see them embarked on this idea of a family economy. You want to talk about a self-sufficient community? That's it, folks. I mean, it doesn't get more self-sufficient than that. It is amazing what God will bless when a family will turn its efforts to working together and using that work as the context for discipleship. Does God want us to disciple? Yeah. Is God going to provide us a context to do that? Yeah. It's called the family economy, and He'll bless it. Also, what you see in these multi-generational families is there is an increased power and influence in society. I mean, just naturally. We have missionary friends that used to be for a time in Zambia, and you couldn't, as an American, waltz into any province of Zambia or Africa, probably for that matter, and just start preaching the gospel, or just start gathering the kids to do a kids crusade, kind of like a lot of times what we see that happening here. Families are very protective of their own. They don't want just some stranger coming in and laying down some new set of ethics that they're not sure they agree with. So the only way that missionaries can accomplish what they need to accomplish by spreading the gospel in unreached areas is they have to go to the tribal chiefs. They have to get the ear and hopefully the adoption of the gospel by they call them, chiefs or kings of their local provinces, but they're basically large families. I mean, they're families that have lived in the same place for generation after generation. And then if they can recruit, if they can have their own chiefs and kings and grandfathers actually bring the message to the community, then it can find the gospel makes inroads. But try as they might, if they're just pounding on those doors from the outside and trying to bring the light of the gospel, it just doesn't penetrate as much. But that's because the families are cohesive. The relationships are intact. And not that everyone does it perfect in other countries or in primitive cultures, but they do understand the value of an ordered family and the protective nature of it. And the same thing would apply in our society. Families, that are strong, that are enterprising, that are self-sufficient. I don't want to steal my next point, but that's one of my next points. They form a natural barrier against incursions from the outside. And the inverse of that is also true. The natural consequence of lower fertility is diminished power of the family in a society and increased power to corporations and governments, which is exactly what they're after. Families are the first line of defense against the influences of a hostile culture. And that's why the powers that be are threatened by strong families. Birth rates since 1960 have plummeted from 3.7 births per woman to 1.8 today, according to the Centers for Disease Control. The birth rate in the U.S. has generally been below replacement since 1971. And the birth rate in all modern Western nations is currently below replacement level, which means if we did nothing but continue the current trend, our civilization would cease to exist of its own accord. So, biblical households buck that trend. Number 7, self-sufficient. What do I mean by self-sufficiency? You see this term thrown around, self-reliance. It's not so much about the idea of self. It's not a perfect moniker for this. The real idea behind this is not being dependent, pursuing your own independence. In 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul writes, "Aspire to live quietly, to mind your own affairs, to work with your hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one." That's right there in the Bible. In 1 Timothy 5, "But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." So yes, in the most basic sense, biblical households are to be self-sufficient, to provide for the needs of their own members and their extended relatives. But I am convinced that this command extends further than simply having enough money to buy food and raiment, or just the economic dimension of provision. Because if that's all that you have, you're still in a place of extreme dependency. You're dependent on an employer to provide you with a paycheck. You're dependent on the grocery stores to supply you with food. You are dependent on logistics and transportation to carry your food to the grocery stores, on manufacturing plants to process your foods, on farmers to grow your food, on migrant workers to harvest your food, on chemical fertilizers and pesticides to poison your food, on seed companies to genetically modify your food, and so on. And you are dependent on a currency which is itself based on nothing but the, quote, "full faith and confidence of the United States government." In other words, a promise from a politician. So in short, if your ability to provide is solely in economic terms, you are dependent on the whole supply chain from seed to store. Instead of being dependent on no one, as Paul admonishes, you are dependent on everyone. So rather than money and a moneyed exchange alone, we ought to be seeking to supply as much as we can directly from the land, God's original source of provision. Now, I realize that's not a possibility for most of industrialized cities, but at least be doing something to move in that direction. Can you do something to increase your family's self-sufficiency? My wife and I started with potted tomato plants on our apartment balcony. From there, when we moved to Minneapolis, South Minneapolis, we had a 1/10 of an acre lot, and we tore up the whole lot and put gardens in, raised bed gardens. Tore out all the rocks and spirea and put raspberry canes. Just try to do something. That eventually led to us moving to a 10-acre farm where we are now. The other thing that you can do if you don't have any access to land is you can support those who do. Michael Pollan says, "Shake the hand that feeds you." Try to meet farmers directly. By the way, we had people calling us during the pandemic saying wanting to buy chicken or wanting to buy beef or wanting to buy things, from our farm. We're not a store. It doesn't work that way. We sell to people who want to buy from us, but it takes a long time to raise the animals to sell. And it's not something that you can just dial up when you're hungry and find a farmer and say, "Hey, I'd like to buy some meat from you. My grocery store is out of chicken." It doesn't work that way. You have to have those relationships intact before. So a great way to do that is just go down to your local farmer's market. Start getting to know these farms. Start touring these farms. Offer to help. Offer to volunteer. But there's a lot of ways that you can set your family on a trajectory of self-sufficiency. And maybe you won't, but maybe your children or grandchildren will benefit from that. Number 8, freedom. The main byproduct of self-sufficiency is freedom. John Adams wrote, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. You heard that quote before? The thing we have to realize is that it was also written for an agrarian people, a self-sufficient people. Self-sufficient households are not dependent on the political sentiments of the day. You think back to the Great Depression in the 1930s. Who did that hit hardest? Who did the pandemic hit hardest? Who did the other recessions in the last 100, 150 years hit the hardest? It hit those who were most dependent on the city infrastructure that did not have any means to provide for themselves. In the Great Depression, people who lived on farms, they all still had jobs. They still had food. They often were taken in, and my grandfather was taken in by a farm, and he worked there, and that's how they survived the Great Depression. We have other family members that say they didn't even know there was a depression. Everything was going on as usual. Their stock was standing in the barn. It wasn't a speculative asset on Wall Street. So these are things that are the natural byproducts. Cancel culture, government mandates do not threaten the vibrant home economy. So what's the inverse of that? What happens when 90% of the population is working for someone else? What does that do to a family's sovereignty and independence? What does it do to a community's independence and sense of identity? To be completely dependent on corporations outside the community or dependent on corporations on the other side of the globe. Wendell Berry writes, if there is no household or community economy, then family members and neighbors are no longer useful to one another. When people are no longer useful to one another, the centripetal force of family and community fails, and people fall into dependence on exterior economies and organizations. The hegemony of professionals and professionalism erects itself on local failure. And from then on, the locality exists merely as a market for consumer goods and as a source of raw material, human and natural. Number 9, biblical households engage with the stewardship, and I would say alignment with the created order. Families who seek to be self-sufficient have a natural and a free inclination to take care of the source of their provision. That is the created order. And I'm not saying that abuses can't happen on family farms, but the kind of wholesale abandonment and disconnect from the land that has been given rise from the industrialization of our society is unlike anything we've seen before the industrial age. A righteous man regards the life of his beasts, Proverbs says. How does a righteous man regard his beast if he has no beasts? If those beasts are penned up thousands of miles away, standing knee-deep in their own waste, never seeing a patch of grass or breathing fresh air a day in their lives, is this what God intended when he put creation under our care? Joel Salatin writes that the average person is still under the aberrant delusion that food should be somebody else's responsibility until I'm ready to eat it. Now, on the other end of that spectrum, we have the extreme environmentalists who are trying to solve the problem by growing meat in a petri dish. They're flying their charter jets to Davos to try to solve all of our problems. These rich billionaires that, want us to eat bugs. They want all the downstream problems of industrialism to be rectified, but they don't want to give up their Gulfstream jets and limousines, and they certainly don't want to get their hands dirty. My advice to Bill Gates, if you're watching, Bill, would be to settle down on a few of those hundreds of thousands of acres you own and get some chickens and learn to feed yourself before you try to solve the rest of our problems. Number 10, generational. Biblical households think generationally. Part of the reason for that is because they live generationally. 3 or more generations in one household was the normative experience for most of human history. Prior to 1860, so before the Civil War, 70% of senior adults lived with their adult children. Today, that number is less than 10%. Actually, we've seen quite the reversal. Grandpa's in the senior home, but Junior won't leave home. He's 26 years old and still living in the basement playing video games. But historically, both Grandpa and Junior were there together on the farm. There was a deliberate mentorship process happening, and parents were preparing their children to inherit the land and build productive households of their own. Alan Carlson says, the natural history of a family is that rural couples marry, bear an average of 9 children, settle those children on the land, and then retire. 11, biblical households are community-minded. Everyday life was not separated from the church in the New Testament. You'll have a hard time finding the American concept of church in the New Testament. I had a friend who was actually converted over in Turkey. And for the first few years of his experience as a Christian, they met together constantly, frequently, wherever they could get together, whether it was a house or a coffee shop. They were also always pursuing the Lord, meeting together daily in the temple, as they describe it in Acts. He got over to America. He married an American woman, and he came over to America, and he started getting involved, thinking, this is where our missionaries came who brought the gospel to us. I can't wait to see what it's like in America. And got over to America, and he just was completely dumbfounded at the way that we do church over here. He's saying, how do you get this from the Bible? Where does this come from? All of this pomp and circumstance and the fact that people gather for a few minutes once a week and then disperse to their own lives. You just won't find that in the New Testament. Truly biblical households are drawn to community with other biblical households. And we are starting to see this awakening. We get the other thing besides fathers writing us, telling us of their either desire or their progress towards a family economy. We get this other request or prayer request the most frequently, and that is, how can I find other like-minded families in my area? We get that all the time. And so God is stirring, and He's bringing communities together. And I think this is an exciting time. John 17, Jesus is praying for His disciples and us. And He's saying, I and them and you and me, that they may become perfectly one, so the world may know that you sent me. Says something to that effect 4 times in John 17. And the fundamental, I believe, walking out of the regenerated life is the desire for oneness with the body of Christ. Christian community. And for the lone rangers that are trying to go it alone out there, I can only assume that they're not interested in obeying the commands of Christ, because He's very explicit about this. This is how they will know that we are one. Lastly, because of all these other characteristics that I've already shared, biblical households are inherently evangelistic. They are salt and light to a lost and perishing generation. I've been asked on occasion from folks if I'm being retreatist by, moving to the country, disconnecting from a corporate way of life, homeschooling our kids, growing our own food, some of these things. And it's certainly not our intent to be retreatist. It wasn't the furthest thing from our mind is that it's not that we want to disengage from culture. But I will just explain what we have discovered since we've started to do these things and live this way. Now, I've been a Christian for most of my life, and I've been involved in all kinds of forms of evangelism. I've been street witnessing, door-to-door, distributing tracts. Even went on a couple missions trips and smuggled Bibles into China. And of course, the most important kind of evangelism, arguing in internet forums. Despite all those things, however, I've never had as much impact as when I started focusing on raising my family well. Raising my sons and daughters in the truth, working together as a family, becoming more self-sufficient, stewarding God's creation. So my answer to the charge, am I being retreatist, is that people come to us. We literally have hundreds of people coming to our farm every year. We've set up these events for people just to try to have more of a touch point and an opportunity, because so many people would come out to our farm every week. We just couldn't actually meet the demand and continue on some semblance of normalcy. So we have, in a couple of weeks, we're going to have, we think, probably upwards of 400 people coming to see our baby animals over a couple of days. And more people are coming in a few months after that. But I lived in Minneapolis, in the heart of the city, for 10 years, and we never had people coming out of the woodwork to see how our family reflected God's glory from our 2-bedroom bungalow. So why are they coming? And I think this is the key. I think they're coming because they see something different. They want to know more. It's a form of evangelism Jesus referred to as a city on a hill. You can't hide it. There's just something about a biblical household that stops people dead in their tracks. They don't have a reference point for it. And they don't certainly have an answer for it. It's an increasingly bright light in an increasingly dark time. It exposes the evil deeds without saying a word. Not that I'm opposed to saying words, as you've all had to endure. I say a lot of words. It's just that it's far more effective for us to live this out as a family, in my experience. Anytime I go and speak, and this conference is an exception. Usually I have one of my kids with me, but we just traveled down to Nashville 2 weeks ago, brought the whole family, went to a series of different conferences, and the response usually goes something like this. Hey, Rory, appreciate what you had to say. I have never seen kids behave so well or work together that way, or siblings treat each other like that. What's going on here that, in your family that's doing this? I mean, they're always far more interested in what our kids are up to while we're there. And that's not part of my script. It's just the fact that we're training our children to work together as a family, and that makes a bigger impact than anything I'm actually saying. I hope that I'm planting some seeds. But that's the idea. That's the city on a hill. That's the salt and the light. It just catches people in a way that words sometimes can't capture. Isaiah says this, and I think it applies to families as well. He says, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and deep darkness the peoples. But the Lord will rise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you." Amen. Thank you.